All right, welcome guys to the inaugural Precious Metal Gens podcast. I'm Zan here with my co-host Brian, and we are excited about this podcast. If you listen to the trailer, you know this is going to be a podcast mainly about late 90s and early 2000s sports cards. Brian and I both grew up in the 90s collecting, and so we have very fond memories of the 90s. And truthfully, we haven't found a whole lot of content or podcasts out there dedicated specifically to this time frame and the sets that were released during that period. So, Brian, what are we doing? Did we make a big mistake by going down this road?
I hope not. We're not going to be focused so much on investor content, but we're going to be talking about cards that we love from the 90s and 2000s a little bit and bounce around in there. And, really think about the 90s as not so much of like a boxed in era of collecting, but more so like a kind of a segue into what we see today. And, it plays a big role in the early 2000s. If you collected Peyton Manning, as a late 90s player, he went all the way into, the 2000s, 2010s. So the 90s kind of set the stage for cards today. And, that's why we love them. And we want to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. I think the general approach to our podcast is going to be Brian and I examining various sets, which, like I said, is very hard to find in the content world. And we'll be interviewing a lot of other collectors who collect from this time period, and namely those who haven't appeared on other card podcasts, because we would like to hear from some fresh voices and kind of about their approach to collecting. But to kind of give you guys an overview of what this show is going to be like, there's always going to be a main segment featured. So whether that is examining a particular set or talking to a particular guest, the main segment will be the focus of the episode and will usually be reflected by the title of the episode. But prior to getting into the main segment on each episode, we want to do three things. One, we want to go over our mail days, kind of our recent pickups that we've gotten in the past week or two, and then move on to a card of the week showcase, which highlights one or more, maybe one or two cards that have come up for auction recently, or maybe that are on auction, or maybe have sold through a fixed marketplace. And then third, we also want to dive into some listener questions. And we realize early on, we're not going to have a ton of those, but hopefully as we progress, we'll be able to solicit questions from people on Instagram, similar to how the crossover does it. If you guys listen to that, it won't be 2 hours of answering questions, but we'll try to work a few in there. So I guess with that said, Brian, do you want to take us into the mail day with your recent pickups?
Yeah, so the first one I had two that went into this past week. The first of which was a 1998 Metal Precious Gems, Jeremy Burnitz of all people. And some of you listening might wonder, if you haven't seen my page, why is he talking about Jeremy Burnitz card? I collect brewers, some modern brewers, Christian Yelich now, but all the way through the early 2000s. And then obviously in the 90s when the Brewers weren't very good, I have a lot of nostalgia for that era of Brewers. But this 98 Metal Precious Gems, Precious Metal Gems is just a beautiful card. I had to warm up to it a little bit. It was one of my least favorite PMGs, believe it or not. And I think it was because I was so obsessed when I was a kid with the 97 football set that when they kind of went away from that comic type background, I really love that. And they went to this, I was kind of like, what are they doing? When I was a kid, that was my thought. And then I just kind of went away from it. I did like the 99. I remember when that came out, but I kind of went away from metal a little bit when they ruined my favorite set. But now lately, past, I'd say 3 or 4 years, I've warmed up to this design. And I mean, I love him more than ever now. It's just a beautiful card of him, running away from a train. It's kind of it's a really, I love this set because of the, some of the photography in it in the background. So they got some really interesting designs. The second one that I picked up was the 2012 Prism Gold Clay Matthews out of 10. It's a big card for me, trying to build the gold Clay Matthews set. I've paired up recently the 2013 with that now, and then the hope to get some other ones and complete that gold run. So that was a big pickup for me. There's been a flurry of Clay Matthews cards on eBay for some reason. I don't know if a collector just sent all his to consignment or something, but there's been blacks, there's been golds, other one-on-ones from NT. It's been crazy. So really happy about that pickup.
Well, congrats, man. And for those of you listening, so this will be on Spotify, but we're also going to upload the video to YouTube, and I'm going to interpolate pictures of these cards that Brian's talking about so that you can see them on the video while we're talking about them. But two questions for you, Brian. So on the Clay Matthews 2012 Prism Gold, I saw that two others, so a total of 3 2012 Clay Matthews Prism Golds, all different serial numbers, had sold in the past like few weeks. So what's up with that? I assume you got one of those on auction and not the fixed price one off PWCC.
Yeah, if you want to look at the sales on Card Ladder, I was the idiot that set the high watermark. But it was really crazy because that auction was running, and I looked days ahead. I didn't even really think to look for comps. I looked for comps originally for it. There wasn't really any, and then I didn't look anymore. I bid. I made my chubby bid. It wasn't like a max bid, but I made a big bid. Won, really happy about it. Then the next day, I don't know why I looked on Card Ladder for it, but I just did, and I see something pops up on PWCC for like way less than I paid, a PSA 10 of all that sold from the vault. And I'm like, I messaged a few people like, what is going on here? I might even sent you the message. And then later, like, I don't know if it was like a week later or something, all of a sudden another one pops up on auction, and he hasn't disclosed it yet, but a person that I know I'm friends with on Instagram, he got it, Packer collector. So that's great. So both of these are in Packers collectors boxes. And then I don't know about the PSA 10, but I mean, I don't know many people that look at the PWCC vault for a Clay Matthews gold or even expect to find something like that. So it was pretty crazy.
It looks like the fixed price, the PSA 10 sold on May 20th. Yours was May 22nd, and then person to be named was May 31. And by the way, I'm glad you said that. I actually didn't know that he didn't want us to disclose, and I was about to name drop him. So I guess if you're the seller of the PSA 10, you don't really have a frame of reference at that point because those other two auctions have ended. But I bet he's looking at these other two now and thinking, why did I do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could. I don't know. You could probably name drop him. I didn't know. He didn't post it yet, but
yeah, I'll leave it to him to do that. But the other question I had was, so the Jeremy Burnitz, the Bruce, how many? You're going for that team set, right?
yeah. So I have 2 other copies. I have the Cirillo in that team set, and then the Dave Nielsen. So I mainly collect. So I collect Cirillo. I try to get pretty deep with his cards. I'm trying to get really all of his really good cards, but then I'm trying to collect the team set of these. But when you get one of these '90s Brewers, by default you end up getting like their best cards because they're like common to everybody else.
So how many Brewers are in that set? Did you say in that team set?
There's 6, I believe. 6 Brewers.
So who are you? Do you know who you're missing?
Woodard, Jaha, and there's somebody else I'm spacing on. I think there's 6 of them.
It's not Cal Eldred, is it?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well, you'll get there, I think. So
yeah.
Well, congrats on those pickups, man. That's awesome. I've got 2. One is I just got in today, which is a 1997 Essential Credentials Vladimir Guerrero. Number 2, 99. 97 is considered Vlad's rookie year. So his prices on 97 cards are a bit higher than 98, 99, but I felt like that was, the goal is to have 97 to 99 credentials for my favorite players. And so I felt like that was kind of an integral piece of the Vlad collection. But I guess I haven't unveiled this yet, so this is a perfect time to do it. The bigger pickup, I'll tell a brief story about this and how it came to be. A couple months ago, I was on the podcast of friend Adam, Splendid Sports. That's at Splendid Sports on Instagram. You can find him on YouTube as well. He has a website. I think it's splendidsports.com. And on that website, he has a contact us page, like a lot of websites do, where you go in, you fill out the form, you put in your contact info, etc. So he got this inquiry through his website from some guy in Texas who said, "Hey, I've got this card. It's 25 years old. What do you think it's worth?" So Adam immediately sent me a screenshot of that. I was floored. So I obviously had the guy's email address. I reached out to him. I said, "Hey, Adam told me you had this. Is this something that you're willing to sell?" He's like, "Yeah, absolutely." I was trying to get an idea on value. And mind you, this guy is not a card collector at all. The comp that he wanted to use was one that he heard about from a friend in 1999. So his comp's like 25 years outdated. But at the same time, I wasn't going to be like, "Here, let me pay you 3 times that," or whatever it was. So, but anyway,
Did you start getting pretty excited when you heard that? Right when you heard the 99 comp, you're like, "Oh boy."
Yeah, yeah. He cited the Randy Johnson, which was he heard in 1999 sold for $7,500, and I believe that Grant Waldorf Stories actually has that same copy now, and it wants a lot more than $7,500 for it. But if that kind of helps you guess what this is. It is the 1999 Jeff Bagwell Gem Masters from Metal Universe, which, I mean, for most baseball players, that's their best card, unless you have a 101 credentials, maybe. But typically, since there's no 98 Gem Masters for baseball, the 99 is the best card. I'll hold it up here. I'll also put the pick, but you can kind of see it here, the effect in the light there.
Yeah, when you sent me the picture of that thing, I mean, it probably doesn't do it justice, seeing it on a screen or
right,
scan.
and even the scan, yeah. And so I would like to get it graded, but I think I told you I don't really want to mail it off. I might as well hand deliver it at the National to PSA, because I mean, you don't have to get a 101 graded, but I mean, the rest of my collection is. So I feel like it's kind of one of those things that eventually is going to happen. So I mean, it came to me in an old, like, yellowing screw down that the guy had it in. So I'm like trying to pry it apart without damaging it. So that is, obviously now the biggest card in my collection.
What's with the so you want to fill us in on the Vladimir Guerrero and Jeff Bagwell collections?
Yeah.
What started that?
Yes. So well, when I was a kid in the 90s, Bagwell was one of my main players. Him and Frank Thomas were like my top two guys I collected. And so I didn't have any. It was mostly inserts, base cards, stuff like that, some parallels. But, when I was getting into baseball, which was only just over a year ago, I had been in the 90s, but wanted to get into baseball. It seemed like a natural direction, for me to go. And then for Vlad, I didn't collect him as a kid, but he was one of my favorite players to watch. It was like he was always lost in the shuffle in Montreal, and I've always kind of shied away from collecting like the Griffeys, the Jeters, the Kobes, the MJs. Number one, it's too expensive, and number two, it's just sort of like everybody's doing it, and so you can't really carve out your own niche quite as well, in my opinion. So that was the reason I picked those two guys.
Yeah, it's a good. I like the lane of. I've always liked the lane of kind of obscure players, but really great players that just fly under the radar. I know it gets talked about a lot now. Trying to build a collection, the best collection of really any player. It doesn't really matter what player you collect. I think it's really more focused on getting the right cards of that player. That's why I'm talking about Jeremy Burnett and Jeff Cirillo. But I mean, with Vlad Guerrero, I mean, really underrated player. No batting gloves, all pine tar, cannon for an arm. Just that guy. A lot of nostalgia for him. So
I know, yeah, he was great. So, okay, well, our next segment that we would like to do after Mail Day's Card of the Week showcase. This week we're going to look at a 1999 Ultra Masterpiece. So that's a 1 of 1 if you're not familiar with it, of Orlando Pace. Not a rookie card. It was graded a PSA 8. It was on auction through MC Sports Cards and ended I think Monday night, June 3rd, and sold for $3,551. Pretty card. I think I was mentioned to you before the episode. I like the 99 better than the 98 because you get that kind of purple background that really makes it stand out from the base set of the platinum medallion. So, what should we make of this sale?
What's really interesting too is the fact that Orlando Pace is, being a tackle offensive lineman, one of few, as far as I know, in any of these late '90s sets. But he just so happened to be, a great Hall of Fame player, and in these late '90s sets. So it's really cool to see an offensive lineman, number one. I think, you got a cross section of like a set collector or just like a one-on-one masterpiece collector, but then you also got like maybe a Rams person or maybe a guy who's, doing that thing where we just talked about, that kind of obscure player that he loves or she loves, and going after Orlando Pace. So I don't really know, but I think, cards like that, those one-on-ones, they hit a bunch of cross sections, and it really doesn't matter the player, but especially being a Hall of Fame player, being kind of an obscure guy, really obscure player, being an offensive tackle. But there's there's a Rubies that's listed on eBay as well for pretty cheap too of him. And it's like, I've seen some of his cards pop up. He's got a really cool 97 Finest Embossed Refractor that, we'll talk about those cards later. But it's, it's really cool to see stuff like this sell for again, offensive lineman for $3,500. I think it's really just, it could be one of any of those things that I mentioned before. And when you mention like the look of the card too, the 99s, I love the 98 platinum medallion set, but the 99s with the color photo of the player and then that background, really just, I think it sets it apart from the 98. So there's a lot of things, the aesthetics, the one-on-one, the player, the team.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I neglected to mention this, but on Sunday night, a one-of-one masterpiece, 99 Ultra of Nomar Garciaparra, sold on PWCC Weekly for just under $3,500. And I know there was some discussion on Instagram about, what Nomar collectors would have projected the sale to be, and it was substantially lower. But like you said, one-of-ones are their own animal. I posted something on my story that was touching on this, and I guess maybe I should explain it a little bit, which is that when it comes to one-of-ones, it's not like an out of 50 or an out of 100 where you can use player-to-player comparisons. For instance, if you're pricing, if you're a dealer or something, you want to sell one, it makes sense. You have to use similar players or other one-of-ones of that player to kind of get an idea of what a price might be. But if you're a collector of that player, I use this example. If a Corey Dillon one-of-one 99 masterpiece came up for auction and it was at, I don't know, $3,000, and I go on Card Ladder and I see the Jerome Bettis had just sold for $2,700, and it's not like I'm going to be like, well, the Bettis sold for 27. I can't bid on this anymore. I'm overpaying. Yeah. It's my only shot to get it. I don't think that overpaying on a one-of-one is as cut and dried as people want to make it out to be.
Yeah, I don't think a lot. So this is the issue too with, like, right now, there's a lot of obsession with comps, and I think that's just like the era that we live in. You remember back in the '90s, you had the Beckett book, and that was it, right? Now, with the sales history of everything right at our fingertips, I think everybody gets obsessed with comps, and that's where that comparison factor comes into play. I've tried to bid for cards or make offers for cards on eBay or other platforms, and the seller's trying to compare, and before you know it, we're running through like the entire history of the player's career, and we're like comparing like accolades and all sorts of stuff. And in reality, it's like a card is separate from that. Yeah, you can talk about the greatness of a player when you're looking at like maybe the whole big picture, but when we're looking at a singular card, I mean, people shouldn't look at it and be like, oh, it's an offensive lineman. Like, there's no way that one-on-one should sell anywhere near Nomar Garciaparra card, or vice versa. But in reality, it's like it's really just about, you've heard it before. It's two people making a deal. It's what one person is going to pay for what the other person has. And in this case, I think, the driving factor is probably the set and, the one-on-one factor. And, like you mentioned before, when it's one-on-ones are in play, it really doesn't matter. I mean, I'll even link it back to even, we were talking about Clay Matthews. There was a Clay Matthews, a 2018 black that was listed when I was saying that there's this flurry of Clay Matthews cards on eBay. And I had no idea that this thing was going to go for what it did. It went for like $2,000, and it was a great pickup by a great collector. But it was way more. Like, I had the 2013 Clay, and it was more than that. And it's not like his market is getting hotter. I mean, the guy's retired. It's just the fact that one-on-ones are in another league. And like, you can say what you want about out of 5s, out of 10s, out of 25s, whatever. And, they don't sell very often, but it's like one-on-ones, there's no barriers. I mean, there's not going to ever be a set comp and a comparison.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that over-reliance on comps is something that I take into account. A couple of things. One, I remember listening to an episode of The Crossover where Chris was like, "Well, if we were bound by cards, bound by past comps, cards would never go up in price. Everybody wants the last price, and so if you kept having that, it would just be static throughout time." Um, and really, with one-of-ones and comps, a comp is a number, obviously, but you don't know exactly how that was arrived at. For instance, what if that fictitious Jerome Bettis had gone on auction and the biggest Jerome Bettis collector in the world like fell asleep, or he missed the auction, or he was like out of the country and had no cell service. Like, there's any number of like things that could have happened that meant he missed out on it, and that doesn't mean that it's worth what it sold for. It might be worth more.
Right.
And that's why we, you and I probably both, well, definitely, we've both paid more than last comp, and probably considerably more in some cases, because we want the card and it might be our only chance to get it.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so our next segment, before we get to the main event, is our listener questions. And what will be moving forward is, hopefully you guys, if you're listening, will respond to our Instagram story each week and give us questions. It can be what's on your mind, or just sort of a topic that you want us to discuss. But for today's purposes, we'll look at a common question that I've heard from people who are kind of making their way into the 90s and 2000s, which is, how do I start collecting? Where do I start? What are the best cards to get? How do I learn about these sets, parallels, and inserts? And I remember when I was starting out in 90s, it is very complex. The sheer amount of sets, and then once you get into the sets, figuring out the parallels and how certain sets work. We're going to talk about 97 Finest, but I think about 98 Topps Gold Label. I think about 97 and 98 Flair Showcase. And those sets are not easy to understand at first blush, and that can scare off a lot of collectors. But I think one of the big things about 90s is you don't just jump in and start buying. Prices right now are pretty high on the nicer stuff. And, you want to do your research a little bit, at least for a couple of weeks, trying to figure out what it is you like, what type of cards you want to pursue before you get into it. And before you know it, you've spent way too much money and now you've got to sell stuff off. So I think really doing your research, I use trading card database, tcdb.com. That was kind of my resource. And then for baseball cards, Baseball Cardpedia is better than TCDB. So I would use that a lot. And I still use those. But that's, I feel like, a good way to get familiar with sets. And then changing my Instagram algorithm. What I did was I went through and I just deleted all kinds of accounts that I was following that were focusing, influencers, breakers, people flipping and selling and collecting, say in quotes, collecting modern cards or ultra modern cards. That got all that spam off my feed, and I focused on building my, the accounts that I was following by looking at what other people in the 90s realm were looking at and who they were following. So that was just a couple of tips that I would give to listeners who may be interested in 90s, but don't know how to break in. What do you think, Brian?
I agree with everything you said. And I also think that the most important part about getting into the 90s especially is to figure out, and you might not know it, but like start off like you said by picking a player, team, set, whatever it is that you're going to collect. Like the when you're starting off, I think like figuring out what you like is the most important part. And then once you figure out kind of what you like or you might be interested in, don't be afraid to kind of explore and make a spreadsheet, a list of like cards based on sets that you have researched that might be like grails or things that you want to target, and then maybe pick one or two of those off that you can afford at the time, get them in the mail, take a look at them, kind of sit with them for a little bit and see, do I really like this? Is this the path I want to go? And then if not, you only bought one or two cards, you could probably, move it and figure out something else that you like, in that era, if it's not the player or whatever. I mean, you and I both have gone through a number of player collections, even more so recently. I've just recently got in, I think, a position with my collection where I want to focus on for the long term. But I know that you've been kind of moving around, not so much with different players, but you've had to kind of, do some things to kind of get into deeper situations with the players that you're collecting. So, I mean, there's really not one size fits all model. You can't really be scared to buy a card and then have to move it if you want to go on from it. So like 90s collection, if you're a person that's coming in from, let's say, like vintage, all right, I collect vintage too on the side. So I used to collect it even more than I do now. Um, but with vintage, it's a lot easier in terms of you have the layout of the cards. It's a little different. You don't have the parallels, and you don't have to look so much at the sets. People fall in love with certain era or certain years of, like Topps vintage cards, and they'll collect the set, or they'll collect a player or a Hall of Fame run or whatever. With the 90s, it's really impossible just to jump in like that. Like, oh, I like Hank Aaron, so I'm just going to get his entire run. Well, you can't just pick a more modern player like in the 90s or 2000, just get their entire catalog of cards. It's not possible. So I mean, someone coming in from being used to collecting the vintage era or something, they want to get in the 90s or 2000s, you kind of have to make a list, like maybe a top 10 of some big cards that you want to target, and you have to get the feel for it. Buy a card, see if you like it. You might not like it. Get a different player. Teams are what I focus on. So my Packers and Brewers stuff. That seems the easiest for me, but it's not for everybody. So
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point. There's kind of multiple ways to approach it. One is team set collecting, going, well, hey, I can't decide on a player I really want to collect, so I'm going to go with my favorite team from the era. Or maybe you do have a favorite player you want to collect, or multiple favorite players. Or maybe you have a set that you really like. So if you like 97 Finest and you want to build out the whole refractor set, that's another avenue. As far as player collecting goes, one thing that I've found helpful is kind of targeting 3 or 4 players from whatever sport you're into. And then you start buying cards of them, not too expensive at first. But I think naturally, as you progress, you learn which of those PCs you prefer over the other ones. Because I remember I was doing a Randy Johnson PC, but I was always kind of saving my money for Pedro and Favre. And that's when I kind of realized, like, this is always going to take a back seat to those, and it's always going to be the first thing that I'm going to cut when I have to consolidate. Same with the basketball road. I tried to go down that road. But it is a little bit of trial and error to figure out what you like, who you like. And then I don't start too big. I start with base, start with inserts, maybe some high numbered stuff. You don't want to jump in and spend $1,000 on the first card and then realize you don't like it later on. I think the general trajectory that you and I have both been on is we start small, you accumulate, you see a bigger card. Wow, I've got these 10 cards I can sell to get that bigger card. And before long, you're at the serial number to 100 and then to 50, 25, or whatever, whatever it is. So there's definitely a lot of ways in which you can explore the 90s, and it doesn't have to be so rote. It can be, player, team, or just set generally. So I think
definitely.
that's a good segue. So we're talking about set collecting. Today's focus is 1997 Finest, and the reason we picked this is Brian has done a lot of research into this set and wrote up a great article for stacking slabs, but unfortunately for those of you who don't subscribe to the Patreon account, you can't read it. So we thought it'd be a good idea to kind of start it off. I don't love this set, honestly, and it's not something that I've ever really looked deeply into. I'm familiar with it, but I think Brian's got a PowerPoint here. So if you're listening, I would highly recommend going and checking this out on YouTube so that you can kind of see some of these visuals, because it can be a little bit difficult to understand some of this. So without further ado, Brian, take it away.
Yeah, so when we're talking about the 97 Finest, the reason why I got into this set initially was about a year ago. I was just exploring some, different cards, different sets and stuff where I was like, wow, I should just, I'd like to do my player stuff and my team stuff, but I'd like to really get into a set. And it was a set that I always liked as a kid, but I never could pull a embossed refractor. They were very difficult, and that's what I was targeting. So, and even as singles, I couldn't buy them, but it was something now that I was seeing regularly online on eBay for decent prices, nothing crazy. But I also thought they were cool because of the way the cards, the fractured set, which I'll talk about in a minute. So when I started exploring this set, I'm like, wow, this thing's really confusing. So I was trying to gather information, and lo and behold, I found something on Blowout forums where it was talking about how the set was broken down. And then I saw another post that was talking about some things that are not so good about the set, which I'll get into. So it's really just, I like the mystery of it, the way it's designed. It's unlike anything else. So when we talk about the set structure, kind of going in, it's a fractured set, like I said before. Zan, do you have something to say?
Oh, sorry. No, I was just gonna, tell us a little bit about the base and everything. I understand that I think baseball had 350 cards, basketball had 326 cards in the set. I don't know how many football had. Don't have it in my notes. Didn't do my homework. But just take us a little bit through the base set and kind of what we see here on the screen.
Yeah, moving through it, just as I go through this info, baseball and football are essentially like equal. They're like the same. Basketball is like the separate thing to look at, and they did things a little bit differently, probably for the better, as we'll get to. But as far as the set structure, they're pretty much the same, other than how many cards are in each set. So by fractured set, I mean in 1996, if you remember those Finest, they had different levels of scarcity kind of built into the set. For a person who's not familiar with it, if you collect Modern cards, like the select sets, so like the Modern Select, Panini Select sets, where they have like the field level, the concourse level, and all that other stuff. It's the same type of thing where there's different levels in the set that are more scarce than others, even in the base set. And then that plays into more even deeper scarcity or rarity when you get into like the refractors and the parallels. So you have the bronze. It's broken down in bronze, silver, and gold. So for bronze, it's a common card that's in every pack, and then the silvers in the base set are 1 out of every 4 packs. They're labeled as uncommon on the back of the card. For those of you looking at this, you can see there's a picture of the back of a Jeter card, and you can see it says rare and refractor. So they did a good job of numbering the card, the theme of the card at the bottom, it's like a little triplicate box, and it says what the theme is, if it's like Masters, or they have different names for the theme. And then there's numbers in those themes, which get, again, another level of craziness in the set. And then it says if it's rare, uncommon, or common. So the golds are the rare. They're out of 24, or 1 out of every 24 packs, pack ratio. But again, the baseball and the football, as we move forward talking about this, they're not numbered, which is, you're going to see, is kind of a problem. Pictured, there's Stephon Marbury, example of a bronze. The bronze are cool for common card. I mean, they're fantastic design. Every card in this set, that's really what appealed to me, is every card in this set is awesome. I think the way that they look, there's some issues with the set that they were kind of testing out that I think caused a lot of confusion, a lot of issues with people collecting it today. So,
and at that time, we, besides Bowman Chrome, Topps Chrome, we didn't have a ton of, everything's Chrome now, we didn't have a ton of Chrome sets. So they were definitely on the forefront of design. So take us through some of the parallels here.
Yeah, so with the parallels, what they're doing is they're really trying, like you said, they're trying a lot of different things. You can tell Topps and Finest is really trying to experiment with stuff. And if you think of this set, not only is it a fractured set where there's like built-in rarity for each level within the set, but they're also adding in like different design, multiple design elements for each card. So like you have a refractor. Okay, everybody listening to this probably knows what a refractor is. The bronze refractor was 1 out of 12. Silver is 1 out of every 48 packs, and the gold is 1 out of 288. But this is where you start getting the serial numbering. Now you got to remember this is 1997, so serial numbering is relatively new. In 1997, and the basketball refractors were silver out of 1090 and the golds out of 289. But then we start getting a thing called embossed part of this, or embossed parallel. And if you think back to like the old action pack cards, the early 90s action pack cards I loved, especially in football, where the card itself was kind of like, it was raised up. The surface of the car was raised up where the player photo was. So they incorporate that now into the set. So you can get cards that are just refractors. You can get cards that are like embossed or raised up, and those are they are just pack odds at this point for really all the sets. So 1 out of every 16 packs gets a silver embossed, and 1 out of every 96 packs for baseball, football, and basketball, as far as I know, gets a gold. But these embossed cards, there's no refractor finish on the base version of embossed, and they're only for the silver and gold. But you do have embossed refractors. So that's the next layer on this. So you have silver out of 192 for baseball and football, and then you have gold out of 1,152 packs. And for basketball, those are your numbered ones. These are your high level, high sales. If you look at sales data from this set, these are the big ones. So for basketball, they're numbered out of 74. They state that it's the same pack odds. You got to remember too that there's less cards in that basketball set too. For silvers for basketball, they're out of 263. But if we're to assume that these pack odds are legit, there's essentially, like, from what I could calculate and from what others I talked to calculate, there's about 3,000 more sets of baseball and football made if you're to take into account that the basketball set's smaller and they're numbered out of 74 and 263 for the silver and gold respectively. So it's very confusing, I think, for someone that's just trying to learn about the set. But the die cutting, so we'll get into it, the aesthetics, but you're combining die cutting, refractor finish, an embossed finish on it. I mean, you're combining three things into one card, three different design elements into one card, which is crazy. It's crazy in general, but it's crazy at the time too. And then serial numbering in basketball. So
Real quick, the embossed refractors in baseball, obviously, like you just mentioned, they're not numbered. I have read varying opinions on what the print run of the gold embossed refractors are in baseball. Some people say 25, some say 40, some say 75. I've seen 150. Do we have any idea what it's closer to?
I don't think anybody's got a great answer for it. I mean, there's there's speculation, but I mean, unless you talk to somebody that was designing this thing in production and in Topps, I don't know how you could get 100% answer. Some of the people I've talked to, or some of the things I've read, have tried to do like, the reverse calculation of like the case production and all that. I mean, I know it's stated from Topps, the pack odds are the same for football and baseball for the golds, 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,152. They say that basketball had the same and that they're out of 74, but that's where that case production comes into play, because it's a 350 card set, as opposed to a smaller set for basketball, which was 106 embossed refractors. So there's 44 less embossed refractors. So it's like, if you're doing the math, there's got to be more than 74 gold embossed refractors for football and baseball than there are for basketball, right? I mean, if I'm doing the math right, that's got to be it.
I think you're right.
So this is where things get really sketchy. So if everything wasn't confusing enough, Now you throw in that, you know, it's, I don't like to call them, they're not backdoor copies in my opinion, because when I think of a backdoor copy, I'm thinking of like someone post production or pre-production, or either after a set was already made, they had leftover uncut sheets, and they're getting these sheets out of the factory, and then they're cutting them themselves and selling them, or slabbing them. These, they're called atomics. That's what Trading Card Database calls them. They're like atomic. They're test proofs. So what they are is what I believe they are, and from a lot of stuff that I've read and researched, these atomic test proofs were a way for Topps at the time to test out this atomic refractor finish on these gold cards. So I think it might have been something like pre-production where they were trying to, you know, discuss the aesthetics and then go move forward with the design. The reason, you know, one of the factors that really plays into that and really solidifies that argument is that, you know, I'll hold this up on the screen. This right here is a copy of it would be an atomic Desmond Howard gold. And it's tough to see on here, but there's really no embossment on this card. Okay, so this is a test proof, and if you look at it, it's a different, if you hold one of these in hand, it's different than the actual embossed refractor. For one, it's not die cut. So the example that we have projected up here is a die cut gold embossed refractor Steve Young. It's die cut, it's got the atomic finish on it. The one next to it that we have up here is one of those atomic test proofs. And what those are is like that Desmond Howard that I held up. It doesn't have an embossment on it. And of course, BGS is one of the companies that loves grading these things, and they love saying it's all sorts of different stuff. It could be anything from missing a die cut on the slab. It could say, or I've seen it where it says wrong refractor. I mean, it's just, BGS loves grading these cards. And Trading Card Database, since there's been so many out since about 2003, Trading Card Database has made it as like a parallel. I don't know who decided that, but you know, Trading Card Database is a great resource, but it's kind of like a Wikipedia of cards. Okay, so like people can suggest items and put things out, and whether it's right or wrong, you know, unless somebody checks it, it's going to stay there. So they call it an atomic refractor. I think that's where that came from. It's really not it's an atomic pattern, but it's really like a test proof. It's a proof.
Okay. So if you're going online or on eBay or something and you're wanting to buy a gold embossed refractor of your guy, I mean, it's hard to tell, you know, in the visual whether it's embossed. So the big tell is just whether it's die cut, right?
Yeah, if they're golds, they're die cut. And you don't really have to worry
Right.
about it so much with the silvers, because the silvers, especially if they're slab, the silvers are the silvers. They have like a mosaic pattern to them. So this is really just it's really just a factor for the golds, which are the high value cards, which we'll get into
Right.
in a minute. So this is why this is a problem. So some people listening might wonder, like, okay, well, so there's these atomic proofs. There's proofs in a lot of different sets that are out there. But why are these a big deal? Well, some of the atomic sales, you know, people are spending money on them like they're actual pack pulled cards, and they're not. They're test proof. So BGS, what makes it even crazier is that BGS loves grading them, but PSA also grades them too. So there's really no way you can say, well, I'll just buy a PSA copy or something and I'll be safe. Well, PSA does grade them. They do a better job of labeling them just as atomic refractors. But when it comes to BGS, I mean, I've seen them ranging from where they just call them a refractor, just a 97 finest refractor, all the way to an embossed refractor with the wrong die cut or missing die cut. So, I mean, you never really know. Some of the sales here, like a Jerry Rice back in it's 2022, but still $1,140. That's an atomic. That's a test copy for that much. And a 97, 98 finest Hardaway, $735. So
Wow. And it looks like that Rice sold through PWCC Weekly, and it doesn't look like there's anything in the title about that being a test proof. And maybe a lot of these people don't know that. I mean, people that work for PWCC, we've seen that with some of the cereals with PMGs. And so maybe this is just not common knowledge, and it doesn't sound like it is from what you're saying.
Right. And this set can make your head spin. So, I mean, I don't blame people for not knowing it. It's just that people, in different levels of the hobby, they're held at a different accountability. So like when you're working for BGS, you're grading cards, your job's to grade cards. So if you're putting labels on cards where you're missing this type of stuff and you're not doing your research, that's a problem. PWCC, you're owning a selling platform. So I mean, there's some requirements there to be knowledgeable and pull things off. But I mean, in PWCC's defense too, it's like, okay, the thing's slabbed. It says what it says. It's like, what are you going to do? I think the bigger problem is really we need to educate the collectors, the sellers, the buyers in general of stuff like this and why it's a problem. I mean, it creates confusion. It just hurts the overall market because people use these type of things. If they're not educated, sellers will use this stuff as like comps when you're trying to negotiate a sale. They're like, well, no, look at this Jerry Rice. This sold like this. Well, or this Hardaway, this sold like this. Well, no, you're comping a test proof, and then they're like, well, what's that? And then you have to get into the whole discussion about what that is instead of just dealing with your cards. So these are some things that are, this next slide here is, if you're looking at this, these are some current atomics that are listed on eBay as of recording this right now, and it's kind of scary. The top one's actually really scary. If you're looking at this, you could see you can make out who the seller is. I've done sales with this person, and they're a really good collector and a good person. But again, this person has this card listed as a BGS 9.5 Griffey gold power refractor, and he says embossed gold power refractor. He says power because that's the theme of the card is power, so power hitter. He's listed as wrong refractor, and the reason why he does that is because you'll see in the example below, as I mentioned before, BGS labels these things sometimes as wrong refractor. I don't know what that means. Like you're grading a card and you're saying, oh, wrong refractor. Like, what does that mean? Like I put the wrong refractor in the case, or I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm just saying wrong. Like, I don't know what that is. But this Griffey, it doesn't even say embossed refractor on it, number one. It just says 97 finest refractor, but it's got the embossed design, which is that atomic. So, and he's listing it as embossed gold. So somebody not knowing, you go on there, it's listed for $4,500. Like it's not chump change. Same with that ComC is the next one. They're listing this Sosa for $3,329 in a BGS 9.5. That's a atomic test copy, and it says missing die cut. Some of these will say missing die cut on them. The images next to that is showing the difference between just a typical gold refractor of Griffey and then the actual embossed gold refractor. It's got that decal edge on the side, so not every die cut is the same in this set either, which gets crazy. You got to really look closely and see that in baseball, that deckled edge on the gold.
So if you're, well, I guess this is kind of a prime example of why the serial numbering is so important. We have that, obviously, notwithstanding the possibility of fake serials or whatever it may be. But, with basketball, you kind of feel maybe more reasonably safe. Well, this is number 74, 289, or whatever it is, versus baseball and football, where you have no serial number and you're just kind of relying, if you're new, on the slab,
Yeah, so the basketball did it right where they have the serial numbering. And that's one of the reasons I was collecting this set in football. And I kind of moved away from it, not because it wasn't serial numbered, just because, for other reasons that you mentioned earlier in the show, like I was trying to focus on other parts of my collection. I'm like, this thing's always going to take a backseat if a Favre comes up or something. So I stopped collecting it for that reason. But, one of the things is, like, I guess if I were to ever move back into it, I love the baseball and the football, but like basketball, I feel like you're the safest. So if you're collecting the basketball set with that serial numbering, you're safe. You can just see if the card's serial numbered. How many were printed, so you don't have to worry about like the pack odds and like, were there really 74 of these, or did the pack odds make sense like in baseball and football? And then there are the test proofs or the atomics in basketball, but again, if it doesn't have the serial number and the die cut, it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So, and it's a smaller set to collect. So, the market for these cards is really, it's kind of all over the place. The Jordan I put on here one of the most recent sales from 2024 because there's sales dating back to like legit sales that are dating back to like 2021 that are insane prices, but not insane like they're bad, but they're just really high prices. The PSA 10 Jordan just sold for 78K in February 2024, and a BGS 9 did 43K in January, but only 29K in March of 2024. So they're kind of all over the place. You know, your typical players like your Jordan, your Kobe, your Griffey, Rice, Barry Sanders are always going to be your highest sellers in the set. But did you have anything to add with those sales that you looked up? I know you looked up a few of the comps.
Yeah, I was curious to get your thoughts on this. So I was looking up the highest sales today of 97 finest just generally, and it seems like that MJ embossed refractor, which there's only 74 copies of, sells very often, to the point where I would think that maybe diminishes the desirability of it. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can see that from the pricing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that plays into it. And then also, I didn't even mention before that the greening on these is prevalent, like with most of the late 90s refractors. But the greening, I think on the Jordan, you know, this copy that I have up here has limited amount, but if you find I've seen copies at shows where they're really greened out, and I think that might play into the price as well. Really, for any player too. There's certain players I think that get more green than others. On the last scan that I showed on there, that Steve Young, I used to have that 9.5 Steve Young, and that thing was beautiful. And it seems like that card, I've seen a lot of them like they don't green, but then you see a lot of these Jordans, and a lot of them get really green, especially on his full body shot, not so much his face, but the full body shot, they get green. So that might play into the price difference as well. Just kind of like how that 96 Kobe does, that Topps Chrome refractor.
Right, right. That's a good point. I wasn't thinking about the greening it. And if you are new to the 90s realm, can you, Brian, can you just touch on what you mean by greening?
So from what I understand, it is the greening isn't so much where, you know, people would think like, oh, if you keep your cards out of light, it's not going to, you know, affect your surface on the card and your color is going to be good. It's really, you can't control it. There's cards that get pulled out of packs that are green. They did something with like the color mixture with I don't know if it's just refractor finish. You see them all in the refractors for the finest and the Topps Chrome sets in the late 90s, but the cards will literally turn green. They call it hulking. And cards right out of the pack, like if you opened up a 96 Topps Chrome pack and you got a refractor, I mean, there's a good chance it could be green right out of the pack, not seeing any light. So it's a chemical reaction that has to do with the different color mixture that they did, or something with, you know, the production of the cards. So they say that some cards have been slabbed where they weren't green, and then all of a sudden they turn green down the road. So it might be, you know, inevitable that they all turn green. We don't really know yet, but scary.
Yeah, it sure is. And so that Jordan, obviously those prices are exorbitant. And then you drop down to Kobe. I mean, Kobe BGS 9.5 went from 12K to 8K this year. I mean, that seems like a pretty big difference between him and Jordan relative to their other gaps in prices with other sets. Do you think that's maybe has something to do with the Kobe being more prone to greening, or is it the design, or is there something that makes it maybe less desirable?
I don't know. I don't know what the one that sold for 8K looks like, or even the 12K one. I know that's another one that does get green. I think if I remember correctly, it's like a creator's theme or something like that, where
It
he's
is,
kind of
yeah.
dribbling some. Yeah, and I think he gets really green too. The Griffey, the next one on there, it's a pretty clean card usually. But Griffey, it might just be the 90s basketball market in general. It seems like it hit the peak earlier, and it's kind of coming down a little bit, or not coming down like it's bad. It's just kind of getting back down to like planet Earth. And I see like more of the growth with these cards with the baseball market, like from that Griffey selling in May 2023 a 9.5 for 5,300, and then a BGS 9 selling for 6,300. So it's like the baseball one seems like it's up and coming in price. The basketball is kind of getting back down to a normal level, and then that football, like we talked about before we record, like football is crazy. It's so low in everything, relatively speaking, but especially in this set, it's like it's really not expensive compared to the other sets.
Right. And I think, typically we can look at a Griffey and use that as sort of a bellwether for what a Sanders or a Rice might sell for. But here it's, about a third of the price. And from what I've seen, some of those, the Golden Boston baseball, especially the power ones like Griffey, Bagwell, Bonds, all those guys, they tend to be in pretty good condition as far as greening goes. It doesn't seem to be as bad. And maybe that's because of the sort of the bluish background, the bluish tinting isn't as prone to greening. I don't really know, but it is unusual that there's such a gap between baseball and football. But maybe that's just because baseball is made more desirable for baseball collectors. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I think baseball to football comparison seems to be always much higher.
Right.
I don't really know why, because they generally, a lot of those sets produce the same for baseball and football. When it comes to basketball, it's always like a different animal. But like you said, the amount is just really different. Like the Jerry Rice in that set is like that's that's the toughest one to get, and that's the generally the most expensive one. The Barry Sanders is really close, but like I have listed here is I just saw in one of the groups I'm in Facebook, a Jerry Rice just sold a raw copy, just sold for 2K, which is a really good sale because BGS 9 was selling for 2K in 2022. So I mean, it is going up. Like this set, it's kind of like that idea of like you don't see many of them, but with the increase in these atomic refractors and these test copies, that's where you're just seeing more of the cards. So people are not understanding like what's actually a real pack pulled card and what's actually just a test proof copy. So when you see more of something, you just kind of and you see those prices. So that's confusing comps all over the place, and that's mainly in the football and baseball market. With basketball, not so much because of the serial numbering. Again, that's why it's so good. But with the baseball and the football market, I really think those test proofs are screwing up that market. People might be using those as comps if they don't know. To a buyer and a seller might be using them to comp a card that someone's buying, and that lowers the price, inevitably. So there's a lot of factors I think that play into this.
And so I guess I take all that information process and say, do you think, basketball is going to be the most consistent set going forward in terms of what collectors are looking at, because maybe they feel more comfortable, paying for a card that's numbered and they know, they have the comfort of knowing how many copies are out there.
Yeah, and I think if I was like to get anybody into the set, like if somebody was interested in starting this set and learning about it, I think your safest route if you do like collecting basketball is to get into basketball. So if you like all three of the sports, I'd pick basketball to start with. It's an easier set to learn because there's number one, there's less cards in it. They're all serial numbered. You don't have to feel like uncomfortable at making mistakes. You obviously have great players in the set. It's an awesome set in basketball. The cards are beautiful. But I'd start with basketball to learn the set, and then as you go on, and plus that's the most expensive one too. So I mean, if you get some real bangers in that set, you're good, because everything else, if you want to get into like baseball and football, they're a lot cheaper, especially football.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it is a really good set for a new 90s collector because, even if you're just going for the base set or maybe the refractors, you've got so many visual options out there, right? With the Masters, the Bulldozers, the Dynamos, whatever sport you're in has different sort of like hitmen, I think about defense
Yeah.
in football. So, there's all kinds of different visual designs for you to look through if you're a base collector or fracture collector, and it doesn't have to be so expensive.
Yeah, they pulled out Finest pulled out or Tops pulled out all the stops when they made this. I mean, from base cards to like your embossed refractors, they're just beautiful cards. The design, the putting the you think about the time and planning the themes. I mean, when you talk about cards being art, like this is true art. I mean, they're planning the themes, they're planning the print run of each of the fracturing in the set. They're planning like the refractors, they're planning the embossment. You're combining all these different like characteristics of great 90s cards that everybody loves, the refractors, the die cuts, the embossed, and you're putting it into one set, and then you're breaking apart by like rarity with themes. I just wish that every set, the baseball, football, and basketball, was serial numbered. Unfortunately, that was probably the one pitfall they had, and you wouldn't have a lot of the issues with this atomic garbage that's out there. But overall, it's just I think it is a really cool set for someone that wants to get into, maybe they're a set collector and they want to find one thing to collect in the 90s. Pick a cool set. You got all these different options.
That's awesome. Well, Brian, any final thoughts to take us out on our first episode?
No, I'm really excited that we're going to do this. I think there's a void in podcasts right now in covering this stuff. And I think with the options that we have with the 90s and the 2000s and some of the collectors I know we talked about bringing on, I think it's going to really open up another, a whole world to these types of cards. And it's something we obviously love talking about as much as we can. I know you and I do it, together a lot, but I really look forward to bringing other people on and different collectors that you and I talk about and we talk to on Instagram and hearing about their thought process and, how they dig into sets and why they love the same sets to collect that we do.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. And I hope this show, I think this show will be a good learning process for us both. We both spend a ton of time looking into and researching 90s and 2000 sets, but there are so many collectors out there, a lot of whom we want to have on who know a lot more about all these sets. They've been collecting a lot longer and will obviously give us some insight that Brian and I can't provide. So we're looking forward to that. Next few episodes, we've got some really good guests coming on. I'm going to keep them mum right now in case somebody backs out or something. But we one guest we want to have on in a couple of weeks to talk about big trades. I think that'll be an interesting topic for us to discuss, which is how do you approach a big trade? How did he approach his big trades? What was his thought process in terms of that? So, looking forward to that. And if you haven't yet, please follow us on Spotify. Go to YouTube and check out our channel and subscribe there. We should be up on Apple pretty soon as we get approved. But thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you next week.